Clemson carries the underdog tag again versus mighty Bama, but is this Tiger team more talented and more capable than Texas, LSU, and Notre Dame to take down the Tide? The big one still awaits. The ACC hopes to get back to 500 in postseason play. This is ACC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time with the best bloggers in the conference. And tonight that means Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and also Dan Rubin from BC Interruption. So, gentlemen, of course, regardless of what's happened elsewhere in postseason play, Clemson has made it through as the only undefeated team in major college football onto the national championship game, which could possibly be a second crown for the ACC in 3 years. So again, regardless of what's happened, for those people that just look at who won the national championship game and finished number one, Dan, this could be a very good thing for the ACC.
Well, anytime you get a chance to win a national title, it's a huge deal. And the fact that you're going to possibly win two within a 3-year span, you put a team into the college football playoff each of the first 2 years with undefeated records along the way. It'd really be a crowning achievement for the ACC as the premier conference, arguably, in the nation. It'd be the one thing that every ACC fan would be able to point to and say, this is why we're the best conference in the country. The SEC has its arguments. The Big Ten has its arguments. But to be able to say we've won one of the first two college football playoffs, and that's made 3 national championships in a row, to factor into the national semifinal or national championship 3 years in a row, 2 years of Florida State, 1 year of Clemson, just to be playing on that stage as consistently as they are with success would just be out of this world for the league, and it would be something that would benefit all 14 teams from top to bottom in the ACC.
Mike, you know I love the deep discussion, not the thin, surfacey discussion. I like to grind it down and really find out what's happened and look at the conference top to bottom, especially the better teams, but top to bottom. But perception, reality, we have that argument from time to time. And for those people that strictly perception, the argument starts at the top, and it's going to start with Clemson. And if they win a national championship, as Dan points out, very big news for the ACC.
Yeah, if Clemson wins the title, I mean, I echo everything that Dan said. But, you know, in addition to that, when you look at the first conference that people are going to point to, when comparing, hey, who's the best conference in the country, everybody's going to point to the SEC. Well, the ACC not only has a chance to put a team in the playoff each of the first 2 years, but they have an opportunity to beat what everyone believes to be one of the best teams, one of the best dynasties in college football in Alabama. The consistency's there every year. They have a chance to go out there and beat an SEC school and make the SEC 0-2 in the opening 2 college football playoffs, you know, having not sent a team there last year to the championship, and then having a team be there this year in Alabama and missing out on a potential title. So the ACC does have a chance here to stake their claim as the premier conference in college football, as Dan alluded to. And even though the SEC has, you know, a very top-heavy conference with, you know, some talent all around, top to bottom in the SEC, but if you look at the ACC, even though there could be arguments made that they're just as top-heavy as the SEC, and hey, they produced 2 out of the last 3 national champions and 1 out of the first 2 college football playoff champions as well.
And to extend the case for the ACC, those 2 national championship wins were over SEC teams head-to-head, Auburn, and it would be against Alabama. So I've got the slated bowl games in front of me, you guys. And, of course, the ACC, as we noted off the top, at 4-5, trying to get to 500 on postseason play. So, of course, as we've talked about in recent weeks, the games hold different weight measurements in terms of validity, arguing the conference. So I'm going to run through them real quick and give you my quick one-line take on these games and how valid they are and what they mean. Louisville knocks off Texas A&M 21-17. The Aggies playing their third-string quarterback, but still a good Louisville win for the ACC and going to 8-5 and defeating a like-seeded SEC team. Mississippi State annihilates North Carolina State 51-28. I was not surprised by that game. I think Mississippi State's a really good, legit top 15 to 20 team in the country, and North Carolina State's not quite there. They're more like a top 40 team. Not surprised there. Washington State defeats Miami 20-14. Wazoo was the one team that took Stanford to the wire in the Pac-12. We don't think of Washington State as being a upper echelon team, but they really were right there in the Pac-12, so not a bad loss for the ACC there. Duke squeaks by Indiana 44-41, two very low teams, especially Indiana in the Big Ten. Duke was actually a little higher seeded games. I don't know if that was a fair fight, but it came down to the end, and depending on your vantage of the goalpost, could have been a win for the Big Ten, but mark one down for Duke. So decent win for the ACC right there. This one, I hate to hit you on this one, Mike. Your Virginia Tech Hokies did survive. I don't know that it was the most impressive showing of the bowl season, but wow, almost blew. I know it was a 24-point lead. Might have been a 31-point lead at one point, 55-52. So your thoughts about the Hokies hanging on?
They had 45 points in the first half, and I'm thinking in my head, wow, this inept Virginia Tech offense that I've been watching for a majority of the season. I know Dan's laughing because, I'm talking about inept offenses. I'm talking about Virginia Tech and not Boston College. But the Virginia Tech offense, for the most part, this year struggled, especially when Michael Brewer was out. So they put 45 points on the board in the first half. And, Tulsa's got a terrible defense. So it wasn't like it was unexpected that a lot of points were going to be scored. But I was more surprised with how flat Virginia Tech came out in the second half, not only on offense, but on defense. What the heck happened? Like you said, they had a 24-point lead at one point, ends up going down to the wire. The Hokies survive. Frank Beamer wins his final game, another bowl game, and everybody's happy, I guess. 55-52 win. I mean, it could have been worse. They could have come all the way back and beaten Virginia Tech, but no, it was not a very good showing, especially by the Virginia Tech defense in the second half. It was almost like they seemed like they were getting too complacent there, kind of resting on their laurels a bit, and Tulsa almost came back and stole it away. Anytime
a Power 5 conference contracts a Conference USA or a group of five, it's just not a no. It's just a no-win situation right there. Virginia Tech's supposed to roll in that game. They were a solid 2-touchdown favorite, and unless they looked extremely impressive, it's just a no-win situation for the ACC. Navy dumps Pitt 44-28. Not a great showing for the ACC. Playing though one of the top four teams out of the American Athletic Conference. I'm thinking that translates though because probably a 5 or 6 seed in the ACC. I haven't done the seedings. Okay, the games that really count here. Baylor over North Carolina, not a good showing for the ACC considering Baylor without the top quarterback and second-string quarterback, running back, and wide receiver. Really hobbled in this game. North Carolina loses by 11. Houston dumps Florida State. That one surprised me by 2 touchdowns. They did it rather easily. So Clemson kind of saved the conference because all the focus goes to New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. North Carolina loses, even though that wasn't during that time frame as a top 10 type matchup. That was not good. Florida State looks lousy in the Peach Bowl. Then Clemson kind of saves the conference, Dan.
Yeah, I go back to that Florida State game, and I think it's because it didn't surprise me what happened against Houston. It was one of those games where I had a bad feeling going into it. That I just didn't feel good about Florida State and the Peach Bowl. Houston, I thought, was a little bit better than the 12-1 record even indicated. I really liked them this year. I watched a lot of the American Conference games simply because it had the interest factor when you count in Temple and you count in Memphis and you count in the teams that were at the top and the fact that the bubble needed to break at some point. It did, and it broke in favor of Houston, who winds up in that game. And, I mean, it wasn't as close as 38-24 felt. I know I was watching it at one point, and it was 21-3 in the second quarter. They raced out Houston, and they were outpacing. Florida State had got stuck playing catch-up. And more importantly, when I was watching Florida State, they looked like a team that was just at some point ready for it to be done. The run was over for them. I think once they realized they were in a New Year's Six game, when you come off 2 straight years, there's some type of natural letdown. And I've been waiting all season for kind of that signature moment when you looked at Florida State and you said, all right, the rebuild has to start somewhere. They're not reloading. They're rebuilding, and they're going to take a step back. And I think it happened in the Peach Bowl. And Houston was a very, very good team. Houston probably could have jumped up into any of the power conferences and won 10 games easily. But the fact that I was watching that game and I just had that vibe going into it, and Florida State didn't let me down, whether or not it's better for better or for worse. Now, like you said, Mark, you translate that the other side and you look at Clemson. Well, you're coming out of the New Year's Six, and you're feeling that maybe two ACC teams didn't belong in the New Year's Six bowls, and then you look at what Clemson did. I mean, Oklahoma couldn't keep pace with them. I was watching that game with a friend of mine who is an Oklahoma person, who is an Oklahoma fan. His girlfriend was an Oklahoma cheerleader. I had to watch them, and at some point he just looked at me and he goes, "Can't win this game." He just knew it, and he looked at it and said, "Clemson is that much better than everybody that Oklahoma had seen to that point." So Clemson comes out. They show that they're a mile above maybe the rest or half mile above the rest of the ACC. It helps. And I think when you look at some of the bowl performances, it does help. I still think top to bottom, it goes back to what I had said, which is the top of the conference is elite. The top of the conference, if maybe you take Florida State out of the New Year's Six, you just have Clemson in there, you're looking at a very different dynamic and maybe a very different perception. Because Clemson, they saved the reputation, but if maybe the bowl seeding goes a little differently, we're talking about it a little bit differently.
Okay, Dan, let's try to sort through what you said. Here's what I've got for you. I don't think Houston wins 10 games in the SEC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12. I just don't think they do that. They looked really good against Florida State, but I just think the grind would catch up with them. I don't see them winning, like going 7-1 in one of those conferences.
Maybe we'll find out if they wind up in the Big 12 in a couple of years if expansion goes through.
You
never know.
With Tom Herman on board, I wouldn't be surprised. So, Mike, we previewed all these games, and specifically this Florida State team. They're so loaded on defense. I was surprised that Houston was just able to run the ball up and down the field and just gash holes in this Florida State defense. It surprised me.
Well, let's be clear. I think Houston would win the Big 12 right now after what I saw out of Oklahoma in the bowl game against Clemson.
Really?
I think Houston could win the Big 12 if they were in there right now. Oklahoma was touted as the best team in the Big 12 from probably week 6 or 7 of the season up until, Corso and Herb Street and all the college game day homers picked Oklahoma. Oklahoma was the top pick for the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season. Yeah, really watch this team. They got on the field with Clemson and got smoked. They could not catch up with them at all. I was not impressed by Oklahoma at all in that bowl game. Clemson got out in front, and then that was it. It was over. And Deshaun Watson and that offense, I just don't think, I think if you put an offense like Houston on the field and they got some athletes on defense, and we saw what they did to that Florida State offense, which actually wasn't that bad for a majority of the season. Once Sean McGuire got under center, there were a lot of strides taken by that Seminoles offense. It was just kind of a surprise to me to see Florida State just lay an egg against the Cougars there in the bowl game. I mean, that's kind of what it came down to. Dalvin Cook couldn't run the ball. Sean McGuire had a really brutal first half, and by the time the second half rolled around, he got his head in the game. It was too late, and it never seemed like the Seminoles ever had a chance. So I think when you look at it, if there was ever some conference realignment and you saw Houston ending up in a major conference, I mean, I'm with you, Mark. I don't think they necessarily go 7-1 or 8-2, but I mean, how many Big 12 teams are going to want to sit there and say, yeah, I'm looking forward to playing Houston next week? With the way Tom Herman's running that team right now, I'm not sure there are many teams in the country that would want to face them, even in a non-conference game at the beginning of the season.
Well, when Dan brings up a Power 5 selection for Houston to jump in and compete, that is the selection to make, the Big 12, with the defense that's not played in that conference. I think if they go out to the Pac-12 or play in the Big 10, I think they play decently. I think they win games. I think maybe they go 500 in the conference, maybe 5-3, something like that. I think it's possible, but I say Houston goes 4-4 in the Pac-12 or the Big 10.
I mean, do you think they'd be in the top third in the Big 10?
They're not getting past Ohio State, Michigan State, and Iowa or Michigan. Those four.
I think
fifth
they're
place,
a team,
tops. Not even Wisconsin. They're 7th place in the Big 10.
I disagree. I think they're a team that they could beat Wisconsin tomorrow if they played Friday. They could beat them 4 days later. I mean, that's just how I feel. I mean, I don't think the way I feel about Houston is that they're a really dangerous team with Tom Herman as a coach. And if Tom Herman were to stay there for a long period of time and recruit the way that he has over the last couple seasons, I think they could compete in a major conference. My whole thing is I'm with you. If they were in the Big Ten, they're clearly a rung below in Ohio State, Michigan with Jim Harbaugh, the way he's recruited and the way he's coached historically, in Stanford and in the pros with the 49ers. coming back to Michigan, you saw the instant improvement of the Wolverines this year. I know we're getting a little bit off topic here talking about Houston on ACC show, but I think that it's an interesting conversation to have, especially when you look at Tom Herman being rumored to not only be in some ACC coaching jobs, but also around the SEC and the rest of the country.
Last statement I'll make about Houston, because we have clearly made this a Houston show. Somebody did somewhere, and I definitely contributed to it.
I think that's my fault.
But they definitely competed and defeated the teams within their own conference that went outside the conference and competed well. They did play Louisville earlier in the year, and they beat them by a field goal. And Louisville's decent. Louisville's the fourth or fifth best team in the ACC this year, and they took it to Florida State. They only had one shot. I don't know if they do that 10 times out of 10. I think they do it maybe 3 out of 10, but they did it.
You don't have to do it 10 times, right? You don't have to do it 10 times in a season.
That's right.
Can we all agree they'd probably have beaten Boston College this year?
Oh, yeah.
They could have scored 10. They beat Boston College.
They could score 3 and beat Boston College.
Dan, so when you look at this slate of games that just got played over the last 10 days, is there something that jumps out at you besides the Clemson-Oklahoma game, because you touched upon that says, wow, I'm proud of this league stepping up, this was a good win for the league, or that this team should have stepped up and we should have seen a victory here? This kind of hurts.
There's a part of me that looks at it and says that they are who we thought they were. When you look back over the predictions and you go back through the different bowl games, I think there's a little bit of that element, and I'm not wowed, but I'm also not disheartened by the performance. I thought Miami's loss to Washington State, the fact that Miami even got into a bowl game this year, they should be really happy with an 8-4 finish. They go to the Sun Bowl. They play that game in a blizzard out in El Paso, which at the time it was like 65 degrees in Boston, and I'm looking at the snow on TV going, why can't I have that? That would have been great for Christmas. But I'm not disheartened as much by that, because I think Miami was already kind of in reboot mode. They had already hired Mark Richt, but at the same time they're trying to transition out of that game. And when you say go out there and win one, it gets dicey, and Washington State came out and beat them. The game that I think I thought, Indiana and Duke up and I didn't think Indiana was as bad maybe as people were giving them credit for against Duke. I think I might have taken Indiana to win that game, which if we roll back, I probably didn't. But I enjoyed watching that game. It was what I thought was going to happen. Came down to the end. I had that feeling that it was going to be evenly played. Thought Pittsburgh was going to come out flat and lose to Navy bad. They lost to Navy bad. In Virginia Tech, I had the feeling I knew Tulsa was going to give up a ton of points. And whatever happened there, all right, they scored. They won the game. I guess that's what matters the most. And I guess that game, the best part of that game was that I was looking at my father-in-law watching it, and I said, I bet you they hit the over in the first half, and they did. They hit the over-under in the first half. When it was 40, 38-10 or whatever it was. But it was things happen, and I don't think I'm wowed, but I'm also not disheartened when it comes down to when it boils down to it for the ACC. They are who we thought they were.
Okay, throw the ACC hat off, Dan. Do you have to see Clemson take on Bama to rate this conference, or can you say comfortably right now it's the blank best conference?
I think definitively I can say it's one of the top 2 conferences in the nation, and here's what I mean by that is because you're going to wind in one of the top 2 based off of results in a given season when you look at the top of the conference. Top to bottom, I think any conference you look at and you say the top of the conference is among the best in the nation, and the bottom of the conference is among the worst in the nation. When I look at the Big 12, I don't think it competes. When I look at the Pac-12, I don't think it competes top to bottom. So that puts it in the top 3 or 4 leagues. At that point, it's throwing it against the wall and saying, who do we think? And then it gets into the nitty-gritty. I will say this. I think if Clemson beats Alabama, it's a huge stamp, and I know I'm riding the ACC train. I don't think they can beat Alabama. I'm telling you right now, I know I'm giving away my pick, but I think Alabama could probably beat the Cleveland Browns right now. No offense, Mark. But when you look at the league top to bottom, the top 3, take the top 3 teams in every division, in both divisions. I would take them against anybody on any given day. And then when you get into the bottom teams of both divisions, I would take everybody over them on any given day, depending on who they're playing.
We could have a 2-hour show tonight. You know that, guys, because I can play the devil's advocate for any other conference and just go at it just for fun, and I'd believe 75% of it, and 25% I'd just be a pain in the... But, man, I just don't think you take the top 3 in the ACC either division and go play Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State. I don't think you can do that with either division.
I mean, the way I look at it is Michigan State didn't look like they belonged on the field against Alabama, and I'm curious to see if Clemson has a similar showing that Michigan State had, because I know that sounds rash, and by no means do I think that Clemson is going to lose the way that Michigan State did. I think Clemson is a much better team than Michigan State. But with that being said, I think you can tell a lot about a conference with how Michigan State looked against Alabama, seeing how big the gap was between the second or third best team in the Big Ten versus, I understand that they were like a top 4, that they were a top 4 team. Michigan State was in the college football playoff. In my opinion, Ohio State was the best team in that conference. I thought Michigan for a time this year was the best team in the conference. By no means did I ever think that Michigan State was the best team in that conference, no matter if Connor Cook played or not. I just wasn't completely sold on that offense, and it came to fruition in the game against Alabama. I think what we're going to learn, if Clemson lays an egg, similar to how Michigan State did against Alabama, if that same thing comes to fruition there in the national championship game, we're going to know pretty quickly if the ACC has separated themselves from the Big Ten or if they're a very similar conference top to bottom. Because I think if you look at Clemson and they get blown out of this national championship game, you're going to say, wow, the third best team in the Big Ten got blown out. But would Ohio State do that against Alabama? Probably not. We saw what happened a year ago. But this year, I mean, with Clemson being the best team in the ACC, they really can't afford to go into a national championship game and just not show up. And I think that that's going to be a huge stamp for the ACC if they win the national championship, like Dan said. But I think it really means more if they lose and lose in a fashion that we're not really expecting.
Okay, over the next few weeks, I'm going to be throwing all the numbers together, all the results, and then you guys can fire away when I say the ACC's whatever. Number 1, Mark, number 5, whatever.
Just to tack on to what Mike was saying there, I'll say this about Clemson. They opened up. They didn't have. You go back. They played Notre Dame and they played South Carolina, and And I understand that some of those games in South Carolina wasn't South Carolina as we know them. And, Notre Dame, I think every year gets a little bit more credit than they probably should at any point in time. But we could probably do a 2-hour show based on that alone. But Clemson went undefeated. It was the #1 seed in the college football playoff. They were the #1 team in the country. The voters, everybody saw them as they were #1 for a while, starting back in November. The 1 versus 2 argument this time in the playoff, I think last year it was exactly what the playoff needed, which was everybody was arguing that the Big 12 champion belonged in. The #4 team goes out, Ohio State, they win the national championship over Oregon coming out of the Pac-12 that got in, and there was maybe an argument that Oregon didn't belong there either. I'm sure some people were arguing that case over the Big 12. But this year you're getting the top 2 teams, one of which is an ACC team, and everybody thinks Clemson's one of the 2 best teams. They're getting the opportunity to prove it. They went out and they proved it against Oklahoma. Whether or not you believe Oklahoma belonged in over Iowa or whoever at that point is totally up to argument, Stanford, whoever. Clemson has the opportunity to prove they're the #1 team in the nation. Dabo doesn't like to hear it. It makes Dabo mad. But, time to put that Clemson thing to rest, and they can do it in a big way by beating Alabama.
You think everybody in the country thinks that these are the 2 best teams. You don't think anybody thinks Ohio State might be one of the 2 best teams, including Vegas, which would make Ohio State a favorite against anybody except maybe Alabama. That's what I've been hearing the last month.
I think there's a possibility that you're always going to have that argument, but the point of and that's why another 2-hour show on our hands. We should expand the playoff to 8 teams. But these are the 4 best teams as voted on. We were supposed to trust the computers. We argued with the computers. We're supposed to trust the rankings. We can argue about the human rankings done by the committee. The computers back with the BCS when one team got in over, and I think Oklahoma wound up playing Miami one year and got murdered, if memory serves right, the year in the national championship game. So you can argue with it, but was the purpose of the committee to get this part done. They voted these are the two best teams. These are the two teams that advanced. I'm willing to buy, even if it weren't an ACC team, I'm willing to drink the Kool-Aid and jump in head first, hook, line, and sinker on it and say, these are the two best teams. Let's roll with it and see what happens.
Well, let me make a distinction, then I'll kick it to Mike, and then we'll get on to some other things. But the distinction I'll make is not that we have the four best teams, but we have the four teams that earned it. So Ohio State, I believe, and a lot of people do, is one of the two or four best teams. But they didn't earn it. They didn't win the Big Ten championship. So I don't believe that they earned it. Michigan State was the obvious choice. The College Football Playoff Committee had a very easy selection year. It was obvious who they needed to go with. So that was laid out for them. But the four teams that earn it aren't necessarily always the four best teams.
Yeah, and I think, when looking at any year, really, you can say, well, this isn't one of the best teams in the country, but they're in this bowl game because they took care of business. And Ohio State, losing the way they did, not winning the Big Ten, that was a huge, Michigan State was in the game for a reason because they won the Big Ten championship and they deserved to be there, no matter what the final score indicated. So I really don't like when people come out and say, you know what, yeah, they didn't deserve to be there, because a lot of pundits are saying that after Michigan State no-showed against Alabama last week, and they're like, well, they didn't belong there. Well, I mean, I guess they didn't belong on the same field as them because Alabama played that well, but you can't dispute why Michigan State was there. They were there because they won the Big Ten, which is arguably one of the two or three best conferences in the country. When you do that, you earn a spot in the playoff, and that's the way it's going to be until the college football playoff expands to an 8-team format.
Exactly. So this is the ACC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and we bring on the best bloggers in the conference. That includes Dan Rubin for BC Interruption. Please follow him at Dan Rubin 12. We got Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC. Check out his site there, and also follow him at Mike McDaniel ACC. So before we get to your picks, gentlemen, Dan, you've got some housekeeping to do for us there up at Boston College. So the rumor mill is rumbling regarding coordination positions.
Yeah, defensive coordinator position has apparently been filled thanks to the Iowa Hawkeyes losing in their bowl game. The coach Jim Reed, who used to be the Boston College defensive coordinator back in 1994, was also the associate head coach and defensive coordinator at Virginia at the beginning of the Mike London era, is apparently going to take the position as defensive coordinator for Boston College. Don Brown leaving to go to Michigan, number one ranked offense. He goes to Michigan. Jim Reed, who is a Massachusetts guy, he was the head coach at UMass. He's a guy from Medford in Massachusetts. If I can go turn on the accent for you, next door to me up here in Malden. But he's going to apparently be the defensive coordinator. And some offensive coordinator rumors have Scott Loeffler from now I can't shut it off. Scott Loeffler from Virginia Tech, the former Virginia Tech offensive coordinator, is rumored to be in the running for the position. It would require a demotion of Todd Fitch, the current offensive coordinator. Can't confirm any. Schools haven't confirmed anything, and I can't confirm anything outside of on the Loeffler site. So, hey, who knows? When you're the 127th ranked offense out of 128 teams, it's believable that you would want to get a new offensive coordinator in there.
Dan, do you turn on the accent or just turn it up? I thought you were just turning it up.
Depends how many beverages I've had.
Okay. All right. We also have a play being made by the Big 12 regarding scheduling and conference championship games, and I know you're working on an article there. What do we know at this point?
We know that next week the NCAA convention kicks off as after the national championship and after all the football on the gridiron is done. The Big 12 is actually bringing forward a proposal which would deregulate conference championships. It's backed by the ACC in terms of voting, where the requirement to have at least 12 teams and 2 divisions to have a conference championship game would be deregulated. Along with that, then the Big 12 with 10 teams would be able to host a conference championship as they see fit. It would be more of a conference-based decision. Also, it would eliminate round-robin regular season requirements to give a conference, as they put it, the flexibility to determine its regular season schedule and preserve non-conference rivalries. That's opposed right now by the Big Ten. The Big Ten is the big vehement opposition to it. The Big Ten thinks that deregulation would essentially cause chaos, and that is also backed by the SEC. So the swing votes right now rely on the Pac-12 and I believe some of the other leagues out there. You have the Pac-12 or the Power Fives, and then you get those other leagues out there like the Sun Belt, the Mountain West, the American. All that's going to be voted on next week, and that's going to have some really big downstream impact because if the vote goes through, it changes the whole course of how conferences can run, and if it doesn't go through, the Big 12 more than likely will expand by a factor of 2 to give them 12 teams and go back to the conference championship, which brings up Houston, a team that we talked about. Houston and Cincinnati are the 2 teams that are biggest rumored right now, according to the ever true world of the internet.
Next week we'll be starting our Houston podcast. We'll start that next week. We need to get right on that. All right, Mike, here we go. Clemson, consensus number 1. College Football Playoff Committee, ever since the first week came out, 14-0, only undefeated team in the country against Alabama. They bring, again, a championship team to the title game with a workmanlike managing type quarterback, i.e. A.J. McCarron and Greg McElroy, a beast at running back, i.e. Mark Ingram and Trent Richardson, a great defense. Clemson, the style points on offense versus Alabama. Your take and prediction.
Yeah, so I think a big part of this game is whether or not Clemson defensive lineman Shaq Lawson is going to be healthy. He was, without a doubt, if Clemson were to get to the national title game, he was going to be the guy that was going to be slated to stop or help stop or at least slow down Derrick Henry. And with him potentially playing, he's practiced this week, if he's anywhere close to 80, 85%, and we can see him make an impact, I think it makes a huge difference in this football game. Derrick Henry has proved throughout most of this season that he can run over and through almost any opponent that he plays against, and that offensive line of Alabama has some of the best run blocking I've ever seen in college football. I mean, they've been absolutely outstanding all year long. So I think with Clemson's defense, you're facing off here with Alabama and Clemson, 2 of the top teams in the country in defensive efficiency. Alabama historically has had trouble on defense adjusting to quarterbacks who can take off and run. The thing about Deshaun Watson is, as good of a runner he is, he's a very, very good passer as well. He does both things equally as well. He doesn't have to throw for 300 yards to win this game, but the key for him is to rush for 100 yards. I think if he rushes for 100 yards and throws for between 250 and 275, I think there's a very good chance Clemson goes on to win this football game. I think the issue is going to be stopping Derrick Henry. It's something that teams across the SEC have had trouble doing all year. Clemson's defense is very, very good, but they have yet to be tested against an offense like an SEC opponent. Notre Dame is probably the closest to it, in all honesty. Florida State, their offense wasn't quite as good as Notre Dame's this year. The Irish gave Clemson a run when Clemson was playing at home in that monsoon. It ended up being a 2-point win after Notre Dame was unable to convert that 2-point conversion late. Ultimately, I think that Deshaun Watson, his ability to run the football, helps keep the Tigers in this game. But I think at the end of the day, Alabama, Derrick Henry is going to be too much. We're going to see it once again. He's the type of guy who can wear down a defense in the fourth quarter. I think it's a close game. It won't be a blowout. It's going to be one of the better national championships that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think the Crimson Tide beat Clemson in the national championship. But with that being said, I don't think Clemson embarrasses himself. I think they go out and make a statement against one of the best teams in the country year after year. And I think it'll still make a statement for how good the ACC is and how far the ACC has come if they're able to compete against one of the top teams in the SEC. So I think Alabama wins a very close game.
Okay, very nice. Alabama over Clemson in a close one, but Mike holding out a bit on Shaq Lawson's injury status as well. All right, Dan, we got Clemson, we got Alabama, and I'm checking Derrick Henry's stats against Michigan State because despite the lopsided score, I think the Spartans held him down pretty well and loaded up against the run, and then it got hurt in the passing game. The defense didn't play despite 38 points, it looks horrible. Didn't play that bad. It was just a disaster on offense. But anyway, we got Clemson, we got Alabama, the probable two best teams in the country playing for the national championship.
Yeah, I'll say this, and I know earlier I already said I really do think Alabama's going to win this game, and there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, top to bottom in the conferences, I think the ACC is an elite, if not the best conference. I'll take that one with me. I think divisional-wise, though, the SEC West is the best division in college football, and those teams, the big joke that I always say, I know I said it. Those teams, Alabama could probably go out and beat the worst NFL teams. They're loaded, and they didn't get to this point by accident. I think Clemson maybe had a little help along the way to boost them up when you look at the teams that they played. When you get a 3 or 4 game stretch where you play Georgia Tech, who is a mess this year, Boston College, who is a mess this year, Miami, who was in the process of falling apart at that point. They blew them out. Miami fired Al Golden probably at halftime of that game, and NC State, who is a paper bowl team. You look at that, and there's something about Clemson that they got into this area because they're one of the 2 best teams in the nation, but are they battle tested enough? And that's where I come from. Alabama is battle tested. They've been battle tested for years upon years upon years. They've been to this area. They know how to win at this area, and they know how to do it playing different games, as Mike pointed out, and as you pointed out too, where Derrick Henry does. He wins the Heisman Trophy, and he's not the guy that needs to beat you. I think when it comes down to it, Dabo Swinney's going to have his team ready. They're going to play the game of their life, but they're just not going to be good enough on that day. Alabama, to me, is at the beginning of the year, I had a feeling that they were probably the best team in the nation. Even despite losing Amari Cooper and losing the pieces that they had from last year. And I'm going to stick with it. And, there's the other side of it. Nick Saban was the defensive coordinator of Bill Belichick. And what do we say about Bill Belichick? They know how to do their job, and they know how to go out and win football games in this area. Business-like approach, Alabama's going to do it.
Very well stated case by both of you, with Alabama winning, according to Mike, and you as well, Dan. I'm going to say that it's going to be a competitive game. Alabama's going to be up by roughly a score at halftime, very competitive third quarter. Then they put on the throttle in the fourth quarter, win, let's say 34-17. I like Alabama winning this game over Clemson. But competitive, maybe 10 minutes left, 8 minutes left, something in that range. Things get away from Clemson at that point. All right, this has been ACC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night from Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC and also Dan Rubin from BC Interruption. See you next time, guys.